Number 4, Bill C-92.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in my ongoing attempts to be an ally, to stand in solidarity with Senator McCallum and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and speak with great concern on Bill C-92.
In Manitoba, First Nations children in Child and Family Services are suffering a humanitarian crisis. As the former Indigenous Services Minister, Jane Philpott described,
child welfare system remains deeply rooted in colonialism. Bill C-92 was not developed with or by First Nations people. Moreover, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, or AMC, has advised that Bill C-92 will likely result in the reversal of the progress already made in the province by First Nations people. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs highlighted that Bill C-92 contains a number of problematic provisions that have the potential to severely impact negatively on First Nations children in Manitoba. A particular concern for the AMC is that the key challenges experienced in Manitoba are not adequately addressed in Bill C-92. These concerns include the gross overrepresentation of First Nations in care, the historically problematic dynamics between First Nations in Manitoba and the provincial government, and the ongoing antagonistic approach to provincial reform of the child welfare system in Manitoba. Continuing or furthering colonial child welfare policies will have detrimental generational effects on First Nations children in Manitoba. As a Manitoban, this is a reality of which I am aware. In Manitoba, there are approximately 11,000 children in care. 90% of these 11,000 children are of Indigenous origin. In January of this year, a First Nations woman had her 2-day-old baby removed from her arms while she sat in a hospital bed. The baby was removed by childcare workers who were escorted into the hospital by police officers. In a written statement, the mother said, "I am sad this occurs so frequently. It has been traumatic to witness the lack of empathy and compassion shown during the apprehension of my child and even during my first court appearance. I am thankful if my baby and I have brought some awareness to this situation that is happening here in Manitoba." May I suggest, colleagues, that this is an astonishingly generous way to respond to the apprehension of your newborn child, to be able to see this as something that is an entrenched pattern, and to hope that by speaking out, that even though it happened to you, you are trying to raise awareness about the extent of this problem. This is not a standalone incident. On average, it has been reported that newborns are seized in Manitoba almost once a day. As a response to the horrific reality of the current state of the child welfare system in Manitoba for First Nations children, in December 2017, First Nations in Manitoba, through the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, signed a Memorandum of Understanding on child welfare with Canada and then Minister of Indigenous Services Jane Philpott, December 2017. As part of the MOU, the agreed-upon work plan was to develop a framework whereby full jurisdiction over child and family matters was to be restored to First Nations within 5 years. I note the difference between full jurisdiction and coordination agreements in the bill, which only recognize full jurisdiction. It was also agreed upon in the 2017 MOU that the federal government would develop legislation that would give effect to the template laws on children and families respecting the 5 nations and language groups in Manitoba. As part of their obligations under that MOU, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs developed the draft Bringing Our Children Home Act, a Manitoba First Nation-specific piece of proposed federal legislation. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs also developed a process and structure for the implementation of the Bringing Our Children Home Act with Indigenous leadership. The Bringing Our Children Home Act was developed through in-depth community consultations on traditional First Nations laws on child welfare. Through the MOU, the development of the Act is an example of what a nation-to-nation relationship could and ought to be. There is a stark contrast between the Bringing Our Children Home Act draft and Bill C-92. It's pan-Indigenous legislation in C-92, and it was not developed in consultation with the First Nations leaders in Manitoba. Bill C-92 fundamentally changes the approach Canada agreed to in the 2017 MOU with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and First Nations in Manitoba, in many cases led by women chiefs who have been deeply involved in trying to reform the system for a very long time. As a result of the discrepancies between Bill C-92 and the Bringing Our Children Home Act, Senator McCallum and I wrote earlier to Minister O'Regan to request a commitment letter in regard to the impact of Bill C-92 on Indigenous services for First Nations in Manitoba. In that letter, we advised the minister that a commitment from him, quote, would help to address these concerns and provide an opportunity to clarify how this legislation in fact supports working towards viable solutions for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and First Nations in their vision for Manitoba child welfare system reform. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs represents 62 out of the 63 recognized First Nations in Manitoba. In committee, the members of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples heard that the Southern Chiefs Organization in Manitoba was supportive of Bill C-92. I would like to share an explanatory statement released by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs this week. The SCO is provincially mandated by the Child and Family Services Authorities Act to appoint board members to the Southern Authority. However, the Southern Authority is created by Manitoba legislation and is ultimately accountable to the Minister of Families in the Manitoba government, not to First Nations governments. This further entrenches the provincial system. The Southern Chiefs Organization is also on record as supporting the province of Manitoba's child welfare reform. However, evidence is mounting that the child welfare reforms in block funding are resulting in dramatic, detrimental effects on First Nations families. As an independent senator for Manitoba, committed to being an ally for Indigenous peoples in the province, and with a focus on the well-being of children and their rights, it is my responsibility to raise these concerns, and I ask for your consideration, colleagues. Thank you. Merci.
McCallum on debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak on the debate at third reading of Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth and families. I confess, colleagues, that despite my initial excitement upon hearing this legislation was in the works, I have some serious misgivings about its execution since studying the product before it went back to the House of Commons. Even with the amendments, there are still too many unanswered questions to this bill. As most of you are well aware, the epidemic of Indigenous children being apprehended and removed from their families has been a serious risk for decades. There have been no tangible improvements to this stark reality, despite countless calls for corrective action to be taken. While I laud the government for their courage in considering this issue, I fear that this bill may not produce the optimistic results they are hoping for. Honourable Senators, in the book entitled Native Children and the Child Welfare System, published in 1983, T. Hunsley, the Executive Director for the Canadian Council on Social Development, stated, "We have seen much progress during the last 60 years concerning the care of children unable to live with their own families. It has, however, become more and more evident that this progress has not benefited Native children and their families. The questions are so complex that few people understand why or even how the system fails to fulfill its obligation to Native children. The CCSC is of the opinion that serious and immediate attention must be given to the shortcomings in the Canadian child welfare system and the way it affects Indigenous peoples. Colleagues, it has now been almost 100 years of apprehension under provincial jurisdictions. Over this time, these systems have continued to remove countless children from their families and their culture without ever addressing the issues that facilitate and perpetuate this cycle. Many of these children continue to live their lives in exile, not being able to reconcile with their families or their communities, nor being able to reconcile with other Canadians. Today, there are still no programs in place for young adults who have aged out of care. They have no safety net. The percentage of these youth who have experienced the juvenile detention centers is unknown. There are not adequate resources for this specific group of children. According to a September 2018 report of the Manitoba Legislative Review Committee entitled Opportunities to Improve Outcomes for Children and Youth, the province of Manitoba saw an 85% increase in the number of children in care over the past decade. 90% of these children were Indigenous. 60% were permanent wards, meaning that they were under the permanent guardianship of a CFS agency, and the guardianship rights of their parents had been terminated. Manitoba's annual child welfare budget has almost tripled over the past 12 years to $514 million in 2016-17. Roughly, this equates to $46,800 per child in care. It should be noted that this figure does not include federal funding for on-reserve child and family services. While Bill C-92 is sparse on details regarding funding, I can only hope that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Manitoba will receive the same amount of funding that the province has been getting on this file. That would be a step toward equity. Honorable Senators, I would like to quote from this Manitoba report in which it states, although the CFS system may be devolved on paper, meaning the meaningful devolution, transfer of services and authority to Indigenous governments and communities has not been a reality. Colleagues, provincial jurisdiction over child welfare is quite frankly a cash cow for the province. At the end of the day, it is not in their economic best interest to simply relinquish control of child welfare. While the province is highly motivated to retain control, Bill C-92 has no mechanism through which the province must act cooperatively and in good faith with Indigenous communities. We have been told in committee that there is a one-year period, but if an agreement, this quote, a one-year period, but if an agreement is reached before then the law gets to be federal law and has paramountcy. They don't have to wait for the 1 year if they have an agreement with the province or territory. There was no mention of a requirement for meetings to take place between the provinces and the federal governments about this transfer of power. There is also no mechanism if the Indigenous group is unable to get the province to the table in the 1 year. Does that mean they will have to wait another year to do the transfer? And who will facilitate this move if you're forcing the province to the table? Who makes the final decision that the Indigenous group is ready to transfer in this situation? And who retains the liability? Honorable Senators, as I am here to represent my region and my province, I would like to inform you of the situation in Manitoba, where the child welfare system and apprehension of Indigenous children is at a crescendo. AMC, who I have worked closely with on this piece of legislation, has indicated time and again of their inability to get the province to the table to discuss this transfer of authority. The unwillingness of the province to discuss this matter while they continue to make money off the backs of First Nations children has been one of the main reasons why the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs do not support this bill. They sought confirmation that the bill would not further entrench provincial jurisdiction over Indigenous governing bodies, but has not received an answer. It should be noted, Honourable Senators, that Manitoba First Nations are in a position of leadership when it comes to addressing this issue. And Senator McPhedran spoke about the MOU. This MOU saw the federal government give AMC $1 million. And I am proud to announce that this legislation is completed, entitled Bringing Our Children Home Act. The Women's Council at AMC has done tremendous work on this act and has worked with all 5 tribes in Manitoba to format this act in each of their languages. Yet, a serious concern exists of Western laws continuing to colonize and override Indigenous governance, despite the fact that AMC is prepared to move forward on this file through their own initiative and legislation. As was noted by one of the advisors in clause by clause, quote, "This affirms a right of inherent to self-government," is what it said, close quote. Is this self-government confined to child welfare legislation, or is this a self-government agreement? How many of the self-government agreements put in place have worked or not worked? What was learned about the self-government agreements that didn't work? And what will be the residual role of the federal government? What about outstanding land claims? There are more questions than answers. Honourable Senators, AMC had initially requested an opt-out clause in this legislation, citing the progress they have made under the aforementioned MOU, as well as the historic and sustained unwillingness of the province to work together positively. However, I found out when we did clause-by-clause study of this bill that such an option was never realistically available. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are forced to stay within the confines of this bill, or else they are left in limbo and never able to opt in. This may be a different story if there was a pending self-government agreement, but for those not in that position, this is a risky endeavor they would be forced to face through the rejection of this legislation. As Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, astutely notes in her op-ed of June 6th, Bill C-92 offers Indigenous children a colonial Faustian bargain: accept the flawed bill in its current state or get nothing. Bill C-92 has caused much division in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and institutions. This is largely due to the fact these 3 groups have distinctly different histories, realities, and needs. For a government that prides itself on taking a distinctions-based approach to Indigenous issues, I am disappointed that such an important piece of legislation is done through a pan-Indigenous approach. What will work for First Nations may not work for other First Nations, for Inuit or Métis. I know that a one-size-fits-all prescription will be ineffective in combating such deep-rooted and historic problems of these 3 groups, each with their distinct and different cultures within themselves. Moreover, a pan-Indigenous model would not be able to take into account the uniqueness of historical and current experiences of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to ensure that funding would be equitable. If the appropriate funding is not given, it will set everyone up to fail and will result in each group being worse off than they are now. Colleagues, Part of the reason that the current and past systems have been unable to make progress in child welfare is that they did not address the social determinants of health and their impact on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lives. If your family cannot provide the basic necessities and are combating health issues such as addictions and depression, which are a result of oppression, how can their situation improve if they are not given the adequate and holistic resources to do so? It is worth noting that social determinants of health like housing, employment, food security, mental health therapy, justice, and so on, which are beyond the scope of this bill, are vitally important in mitigating this cycle of child apprehension. There has been no mention of coordination between the different federal departments and how they would coordinate the services required for each community to accommodate this bill. There are too many unanswered questions for me and for the many women whose voices I bring to this floor, and it's women from across Canada. I will be voting against C-92. I want to thank Cora Morgan, the Child Advocate Office, AMC Women's Council, AMC Grand Chief Arlen Dumas, and all the chiefs in Manitoba for all their hard work through this process. Kinanaskumit Nawao for your advocacy, passion, and determination. Thank you.
Senators, I rise to speak to Bill C-92 as well, and I stand on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I want to take this opportunity to thank the sponsor, Senator Labakan Benson, and colleagues on the Aboriginal Peoples Committee for all of the work on this legislation. Bill C-92 seeks to do three things: affirm the rights and jurisdiction of Indigenous peoples in relation to child and family services, establish a framework for the provision of these services across Canada, and contribute to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The bill has the potential to promote reconciliation by putting the decision-making power back into the hands of Indigenous communities so that they may care for their children on their own terms. However, while I commend the Government of Canada on its efforts, I share the concerns of other colleagues who have spoken and wish that we could have had more time for a comprehensive discussion of this legislation instead of rushing it through in the last weeks of this parliamentary session. Indigenous children deserve no less, particularly in light of Canada's roles in the residential schools, the state-sanctioned removal of children, often referred to as the 60s scoop, and the discriminatory provision of child and family services as per the repeated decisions of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. As a chamber of sober second thought, we have a duty to represent those who are rendered voiceless and to bridge legislative gaps where they exist. I therefore echo some of the concerns that were shared with the Aboriginal Peoples Committee during its pre-study of the legislation. Experts and longtime children's advocates indicated that significant shortcomings exist in the bill, particularly in the concrete ways in which it will impact the lives of Indigenous children. These deficiencies risk making it a paper tiger. The First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada stressed that jurisdiction and funding go hand in hand. Jurisdiction being an inherent right of Indigenous peoples, and funding allowing for the expression of that inherent right. Youth in Care Canada also expressed a need for sufficient and equitable funding for youth in and from care. In light of its 12-year and ongoing litigation against the Crown to try to secure equitable funding for First Nations child and family services, and in the wake of seven, honourable colleagues, Canadian Human Rights Tribunal non-compliance orders against the government since only 2016, the Caring Society called on the Senate to entrench the tribunal's funding principles into this legislation, including an approach that promotes substantive equality and recognizes the needs, culture, and distinctness of the communities in which the children live. Despite the recent addition of a funding statement in the coordination agreement section of the bill by the other place, including wording on substantive equality and a needs-based approach, there remains no no positive obligation on any government, including the federal government, to equitably fund child welfare. In fact, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the Caring Society, referred in committee to a study by the Yellowhead Institute in which 5 leading Indigenous law professors gave the entire bill a C on 5 dimensions. The funding dimension was given a failing grade, and the Institute called for a binding funding agreement. In addition, Bill C-92 does not adopt the Spirit Bearer Plan to redress all inequalities in First Nations services and reform the federal government's relationship with First Nations and their children. The federal government has failed to adopt this plan outside of Bill C-92 and has testified under oath that it has no equivalent plan to address all inequalities in federally funded public services. Any eventual judicial determination that Canada has a positive obligation to fund child welfare could involve extensive litigation, an endeavour that far exceeds the capacity of most First Nations communities. Furthermore, although the bill could prohibit the removal of children on the basis of poverty, this does not address the underlying systemic factors of inequality that drive children into poverty in the first place, including addressing the housing and water crises in First Nations communities and disparities in access to quality early childhood education and provision of maternal health care. Federal officials have repeatedly told us that they have left the wording of the bill vague to allow Indigenous communities flexibility in lawmaking. This may be comforting if there was a strong funding provision that required governments to fund those self-determined visions, but there is not. This leaves open the real possibility that the government's desire for vague language is motivated by a desire to avoid enforceable language that would require it to fund items like post-majority care and primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. The more vague the act, the harder it is for Indigenous communities to hold government to account. To quote Dr. Cindy Blackstock, if you put self-determination on top of inequality, it is not going to realize the dreams of healthy families that this bill tries to promote. Honourable colleagues, when you and I reach the age of majority, while our parents may have happily nudged us out of the nest, most of us were not thrown to the curb or off a cliff. We did not wake up one morning to discover we were on our own, or as a former youth in care, Dr. Brian Raichaba wrote in his book, to be on our own with no direction from home, with no home, no family, no financial support. As members of the National Youth in Care Network, an organization run by and for young people who have been in care, ages 14 to 24, have been documenting since 1988, children leaving the care of the state share the characteristics of homeless people, and too many end up on the streets, dead, or in prison. As we know from the many deaths described by Senator Simons in her comments, and from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action on child welfare and the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, too many young people like Tina Fontaine live in extremely precarious and vulnerable positions when they age out of care of the child welfare system. Despite heartfelt and urgent pleas from many young people and other witnesses, the bill is currently silent when it comes to this crucial need of youth. I would also add that despite the wording of the bill and what I believe to be the government's good intentions, this legislation does not guarantee that regulations will fill in the gaps and address these issues in the future. As I've already mentioned, First Nations have spent over a decade litigating against Canada to get equitable child and family services, and this litigation continues as Canada is refusing to mediate outstanding issues. At the same time, it asks us to rely on their goodwill to discuss funding in the coordination agreements. In its interim report, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls called for full compliance with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling in 2016 that found that Canada was racially discriminating against First Nations children. Last week, the final report from the National Inquiry was released, indicating that this still has not been implemented. The National Inquiry agreed with Dr. Cindy Blackstock when she says, "When I look at the wealth of this country, I think that equality for First Nations children should come in a leap, not in a shuffle." And just frankly, if they can afford to spend $5 billion on a pipeline, they can afford to eradicate inequalities in education and other areas for their kids, end quote. Honourable colleagues, there is no evidence that the Government of Canada will provide equitable funding through regulations in the future. In fact, it continues to resist such calls. As a result, without a legislated funding agreement, the fate of First Nations, Inuit and Métis children is again subject to political priorities about what gets funded and what is in the regulations. Young people who know all too well the failures of child welfare and the challenges of being relegated the children of the state are watching, and they are legitimately frustrated and fearful. We must acknowledge that the trauma and systemic failures are not mere abstractions or theories. They are the lived experiences of far too many children, most especially Indigenous children in this country. For all these reasons, I urge us to not abandon these youth or successive generations to more promises and too few commitments. Whether you vote for or against this legislation, I urge us all to remember that we have a moral, a personal, and a legislative responsibility to do better. Miigwech, thank you, merci.